I used to work as an event coordinator at the Swan and Dolphin Resort/Convention Center. Sometimes we'd have to get there at really early hours of the day before the union laborers showed up. This was to get everything ready and set up for special events and stuff like that. One day, one of my managers had cut my hours due to a budget decline in the company. This resulted in me not making as much money as I used to, which caused me to fall behind on rent. Therefore, I had to start making some money until I could either get more hours or find a new job. Eventually, I began to sell some items on sites like Craigslist and eBay, which added to my income. It wasn't much, but it was enough to financially support myself through this time. At the time, I was in the process of selling a specific type of radio from the 40s that was worth a pretty penny. It was my grandpa's radio, and I guess it somehow got passed on to me after he died. I've gotten several offers for it, but the majority of them were people trying to lowball me for prices too small. At one point, however, I get a message from a guy who seemed really interested in it who was willing to offer me $500 for it, which was more than the listed price. I of course accepted the offer, and he then told me that he could come after 5 after he got off work. This was actually better for me, as I'd be out until 4. Anyway, 5 p.m. rolls around, and a few minutes after, I get a knock at the door and open it. Standing at my doorstep is an older-looking man, maybe late 50s, tall, with a long gray beard. To describe him a little better, he looked like a biker you'd commonly see in country movies. In a very deep and raspy voice, he says, "Hey there, I'm here for that radio?" I happily let him in and show him the radio sitting on the kitchen table, and even got him a snack. Oddly enough, he immediately begins inspecting the condition of it, and even went as far as checking the inside. After what felt like forever, he puts it down and says he'd do it for $300 as the condition wasn't the best. Needless to say, of course, that $500 deal was out the window. He then stares at me with this intimidating look where I felt like I didn't have a choice. In the end, I had to agree and did the deal with him right then. Mind you, I'm a petite 5'7" girl, so I wasn't going to try and argue with someone like him. He gives me the money, puts the radio in his car, thanks me, and drives off. I wasn't sure why, but something about him just gave off a negative vibe, which made me glad he was gone. The rest of the night was normal, where I had been watching a movie in my bed when my phone rang. The call was coming from an unknown number, but the area code was the same. Without thinking much of it, I pick up and immediately recognize the voice on the other end. It was the man from earlier calling me to thank me. What he said, however, will forever be burned into the back of my mind.
"Hey Sally, look, thank you so much for your hospitality and kindness. If I'm being completely honest with you, I was planning to kill you with a knife I had in my back pocket the second I walked into your house. But you were just so kind, I just couldn't pull myself to do it. Take care now."
Right then, my mouth draped open as humanly possible with all these thoughts racing through my mind. If I'm being honest with you, I wasn't sure what to do other than to process as to what I just heard. I would have called the police, but I later found out that the number he was using was fake from an app. That basically meant that even if police were to track the number, it wouldn't lead to him. After that, I removed the listing from Craigslist and never touched the site again. As scary as this was, I never received any updates on his identity or if he's in jail or not. There are seriously some crazy people out in the world who are willing to do anything to you. I emphasize that you please be careful when selling or buying something from sites like Craigslist. You never know who's out there and what they're capable of. This happened when I was in my mid-20s back in 2012 when I was living in Sarasota, Florida. I had just graduated from college and had gotten a job in IT as a software engineer at a really good company. Because of this job, I was able to move out of my parents' house and get an apartment. It wasn't big, but it was spacious enough where I could store most of my stuff. When moving out, odds are you'd probably have a few items left over that you no longer needed or wanted. Well, I had the same situation and had some things I didn't need that I put up for sale on Craigslist. At the time, Craigslist was booming in popularity where people were buying and selling left and right. One of the items I had listed was this large tote I had used back when I played sports. It was in pretty good condition, and I figured I'd snag a deal on it since sports were popular in my town. I'd say within a day, I had gotten a message from someone nearby interested in the tote. He seemed nice, didn't live too far, and was willing to pay more than what I was listing it for. Being so close to me, he'd offered to just meet me at my apartment, which would make for a smoother transaction. I'll be honest, I was a little uncomfortable, knowing that him, a complete stranger, would know where I lived. That being said, I brushed it off and told him I'd do it. Later that night, I hear a knock at the door and was greeted to a man who looked to be in his mid-30s with this Swedish accent. He immediately goes to hug me, telling me that it was a nice way of saying hello in Sweden. Being a gay guy, I didn't really mind it and thought it was a kind gesture. He hugs me for a good 10 seconds before letting go and asking me for the tote. I gladly give it to him, and he then proceeds to pull out a $100 bill and hands it to me, making sure our hands touched. It was a little uncomfortable, but I dismissed it as something people always did in Sweden. He thanks me, hugs me again, and walks down the hallway to the exit. Now let's fast forward till about 2 days later. I happened to be sick on this day and had called off work to rest. As I'm taking a nap in my room, I hear a heavy knocking on my door, which abruptly awoke me. I opened the door and was greeted to 2 police officers and the property manager. Confused, I asked what was going on, to which they then asked if I knew this person. The property manager showed me a photo of a man on his phone who just so happened to be the guy I had sold the tote to. I tell them yes and explained that I had sold him a bag, but that was all I ever knew about him. They take down my name, my description of him, and what he ever said to me or did to me. Whenever I asked why they needed that information, they informed me that they couldn't tell me as of now. That being said, they leave, and it wasn't until a few days later where I had finally gotten my answer. Turns out, the man I had sold the bag to had been wanted for owning 23 terabytes of CP. To put that in perspective, a single terabyte is equivalent to 1,000 gigabytes. This meant that he had about 13,000 hours of content downloaded. When I was told this, I was beyond disgusted, knowing I was talking to a predator, a wanted predator in my home. The tote I had sold him was to keep certain documents that contained information on how to cover his tracks. Obviously, this plan never went through as he did end up getting caught in the end. I was interviewed for about a week by police before my complete shock slowly got back to normal. After that, I deleted my entire Craigslist account and decided to not sell anything else. Anyway, that's my story, and I hope you can take this as a learning opportunity to never trust people online. Before I begin with my story, I want to point out that this isn't the type of story to make you jump out of your seat. This is, however, a very real and traumatizing story for me. To preface this, I'm a female, currently 18 years old and live on a ranch in a very secluded small town in rural Iowa. It mostly consists of multiple farms, lands, fields, etc. I've lived there my whole life and even met some of the people in my town who were very respectful, as it's a quiet little town. I won't mention the name of it as I don't want this getting out there, but it has a population of about 2,000 people. This happened during the summer of 2021 and is by far the most horrifying thing that's ever happened to me. For context, I work at a gun store in my town, which is very safe for the most part. However, I always bike to and from work as both my parents worked late nights in the city and couldn't get me until later in the night. Well, one day, my bike had been stolen by someone from the rack right outside of the shop when I wasn't paying attention. I was obviously pissed because of this and didn't bother contacting the sheriff as they really didn't care what happened around here. Most of the time, they wouldn't take thefts seriously and either half-assed investigated them or claimed that they didn't have enough evidence. With the police no longer being an option, I called my dad telling him the situation and he said he'd come by to get me after work. On the way home that day, he's giving me a lecture throughout the whole car ride about how I was careless. That night, I had been on my computer searching through Craigslist to see if I could find an affordable bike to buy. I didn't need a super expensive bike, just one that would get me from point A to point B. Within 20 minutes, I had found one that seemed like a steal. It was a standard bike that seemed to be in great condition and was only $70. The seller was only 15 miles away from the nearest city, so it was a long drive, but it would be worth it. My parents had been at work that night, and with no car, I had taken an Uber to the drop-off spot. When my ride had dropped me off, I noticed a black van parked on the side of the road with its lights turned off. It was the only vehicle in the area, so I could only assume that was him. I messaged the seller, asking if that was him in the van, to which he then said yes and to come over. I ever so slowly walk over towards the driver's side when I see a man roll down his window and introduced himself as Jeff. He had claimed that he was the one selling the bike and that it was in the back of the van. He then tells me I could go ahead and open the doors and just grab the bike. I then thought to myself as to why he wasn't doing it, and when I asked him this, he said that he had a bad knee and that it hurt to walk. Not wanting to pry and too tired to care, I proceeded to walk towards the back of the van where the bike was. As I'm about to open the doors, I can see very faintly from the window a man wearing a vendetta mask staring back at me. The second I noticed him, I instantly knew that this wasn't some exchange and there was definitely no bike. Not making it obvious I noticed him, I told the driver that I didn't need the bike anymore and that he could go. However, I was afraid if he had known I had seen someone else back there and tried my best to stay calm. I start running towards a nearby Walmart when the driver tries negotiating that he'd lower the price. But no matter what he said, I still ignored him, hoping he'd just go away as I knew there was no bike. I approached the Walmart and that's when the van immediately drives away, disappearing into the night. From there, I had spoken with security about the incident and that's when they had called the police. At that point, I explained where I was, what I did, and what was said. As you could imagine, the listing had been taken down, and I never saw it again. I was unable to give a good description of the van, other than the fact that it was black with windows. I had assumed the cops would tell my parents about this, but given that I was 18, the cops couldn't inform them without my consent. I had Ubered back to my house safely, with thankfully nobody following me. Till this day, I'm still unsure as to what that man's intentions were, but they obviously weren't good. I advise anyone thinking to use Craigslist to not do it, as it's not only sketchy but also dangerous. And for those of you who are gonna do it, I emphasize you please bring someone else along with you. It may just save your life.